Now, on to our guest. Sarah Pullen leads the food systems team at Birmingham City Council, where she has been on a mission to unite the inspiring people behind the city's many diverse food systems projects under the banner of Birmingham Food Revolution movement. The citywide partnership has co-produced the Birmingham Food System Strategy, which aims to transform the city's communities, environment and economy in order to regenerate the food system. Sarah is also the founder of the not-for-profit organisation Leading Applied Behavioural Science. At this organisation, she has developed initiatives that transform our relationships with food, including healthy profits and taste adventures. And I hope she talks about both of those in the talk or gets a moment to in the Q&A if somebody wants to prompt her. Now, thank you all for attending today's Food Thinkers. And please put your hands together, even though you're probably muted, Sarah to the stage. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Christian, and thank you everybody for being able to join today. Anybody who knows me knows this is something I am incredibly passionate about. So I'm grateful for any opportunity to inspire other people to be able to make changes where they are as well. So as Christian said, I've been at Birmingham City Council leading the food system team. It's been about 2.5 years now. And I wasn't actually looking for a job when I stumbled across the opportunity to lead the food team. But when it came up, it just felt like such a moment of eureka, because I've worked across the food system for years, tackling picky eating, working with caterers, looking at supply chains and agriculture. And this was truly the moment where I was like, this is it. This is the way we can weave together so many things and shape our city's food system in Birmingham. But other than that, I'm usually involved with the development of behavioural science-based interventions and just looking at the really practical ways of actually shifting behaviour. So it's all come together really well under my experience in Birmingham. So today I'm going to share 15 top tips that in my opinion, are the core to being able to build a food revolution. And really key to that is being able to collaborate, empower and equalise, because without those things, we cannot truly achieve system change. And so the first really important element that I've identified is that you must have someone whose job it is to work across the system. So many of the times, as many of you will have experienced, there is so much siloed working. Every single department, every organisation, everybody is doing amazing things in their bubble, but there's so rarely somebody to connect the dots and build the relationships across the system to make more things happen. So I'm incredibly lucky that in Birmingham, there's now 5 of us in our team. And that has come about partly because we had a really passionate and inspired director of public health that wanted to prioritise food. We also had political buy-in. But also we've been able to prove ourselves over time. So initially there were 3 of us on a fixed term contract, and now we're a permanent group of 5. And that's because we're achieving so many cross-cutting objectives across the food system that it's easy to see and justify what we're doing, because we've been able to deliver so many projects. But yeah, if you can get even one person whose role it is to speak to everybody across the system, recognise the opportunities, connect people together, you will be so much further ahead with being able to make system change. The next really important thing to achieve is finding the sparks across the system. These are the people who have huge amounts of untapped potential. They're in every organisation, every place across your city, every part of the food system. But at the moment, they're not connected. They are individual people doing amazing work where they are. And this genuinely is my most favourite part of my job, because you discover somebody and you find out that they were already implementing a food revolution, but they were doing it under their own area of the world. Whereas when you start connecting these people together and recognise that by connecting with other people who are connectors, you actually have far bigger influence across the city than you would do otherwise. It's really key to make sure that you've got mutually beneficial relationships when you develop food system approaches as well. Universities are a really prime example. They are a treasure trove of so many departments and so many amazing people doing amazing things. Not just the professors and the students and the other lecturers, but also the staff that are actually looking after their campuses. And they're like mini cities in themselves, university campuses. So they're a great place to test out initiatives and see what's possible. But in Birmingham, we've got 5 universities, so we're incredibly lucky. And it means that literally any topic across the food system, we know there are passionate people across our city who we can connect with. And the way that it works is that you can mutually benefit, because the universities get to connect with policy when you're based in a local authority, influencing policy and developing research that can be applied in practice. And then the local authority benefits from the evidence-based expertise and the wider networks that people have as well. But then beyond that as well, you've also got huge amounts of community networks. Any city will have the most amazing networks of people doing amazing things that you might not know about. So a lot of these people aren't shouting about what they do. They are doing these things independently, whether it's around community-based growing networks, whether it's youth engagement, whether it's food aid projects or anything. But these people are like across the whole city, and you just need to find the people who are the sparks and connect all these people together at every level. But yeah, I think this is a really core step. Once you've got somebody working across the system, you then need to find each of who these people are across every area of your food system, because then you're not doing this alone, you are doing it as a city. And the next step is, little jump ahead there, is building strong, authentic relationships. And I think this is the challenge that I've often seen, where people talk about engagement, like connecting with citizens, engaging with stakeholders, and the more you talk about it in those terms, the drier it seems. You start to lose the fact that this is people. We are connecting with people across the whole city. So I think it's really important that whatever methods we use to engage with people across the city is done with authenticity, where you are building a strong, open relationship that isn't there for a one-off engagement event, but actually you're building a way to communicate in the long term. For example, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, somebody forwarded an email to me because they saw it and I thought, oh, Sarah like this, I'll forward it to you. And it happened to be a newsletter that I was like, oh, that is useful to me. I hadn't even seen this. I think it was one of the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network emails. And it was really useful, and I wasn't signed up. Then I signed up, and 3 days later, at the bottom of that email was a funding opportunity for a food safety project. And I was like, oh, that person in the University of Birmingham is going to love that project. So I sent it to them. 3 days later, we submitted a proposal. And then a week later, we've been awarded a project to develop surplus food food safety guidance to support restaurants with donating food all the way through to food aid projects receiving it. Because we recognise that the current guidance that's out there is also siloed. We have support for businesses, we have support for food aid projects, but we don't have support for the transitions between. But that entire sequence of events purely happened because every one of us felt like we could just reach out to the other person in the network. And I don't think you can underplay how important those types of relationships are across the system. We need to be having relationships without anticipation of what it's going to lead to. We just need to be connected in an authentic way, where whenever an opportunity comes up, we're already primed and ready to make the best of it. Because if I had seen that opportunity and didn't know somebody yet who worked in food safety, I couldn't have maximised on that with a 3-day deadline. But because we were already connected, we mobilised really quickly and submitted it, and now that project's happening. I think there's also examples. I've had people contact me who are doing food procurement research projects. It's one of the biggest challenges we have in local authorities of how to transform food procurement. And I've had academics reach out to me to see if we can partner with them on some research projects that they're doing. And again, that's come about through like a WhatsApp message because I happened to have a good conversation with them at a conference once. So that sort of thing is really, really key. So don't underplay how important it is to genuinely create connections with people across the system, not just in your city, but with other people who are interested in other areas of the food system on a national and international scale too. The next step is to identify whose stories are missing. So the challenge with the system approach is it is absolutely massive. The system is understandably huge because we're talking about every area of the food system, from food sourcing through to supply chains, logistics, distribution, catering, schools, waste, like energy. There's like so many topics, and also across communities, whether it's geographically, whether it's communities of identity, whether it's communities of people who've got different experiences to share. And as a team, we were trying to come up with ways of how on earth do we make sure that we are capturing the stories of everybody whilst making it still manageable for a team of the size that we are, that we can't speak to everybody all the time. But what we need to make sure is that every one of our decisions is being influenced by the genuine experiences and stories across the city. And we don't end up with like the same people responding all the time and not proactively reaching out to others. So what we developed was the Big Bold City tool. So this is still an evolving tool, but essentially it's a way to make sure that we're looking at the system from all angles. That includes looking at across the food cycle, across the life cycle, geographically across the city in all the different areas, and different people and communities and their experiences, whether it's people's experiences because of protected characteristics or experiences of disability and how that influences their interaction with the food system, but also just different situations that people have. Like, what happens when you go through a divorce and you're not living in the same house, you don't have access to the fridge anymore? Or what happens if you're living in shared accommodation and you don't have access to cooking equipment? What happens if you're in a business and money's really tight and you can't make sustainable food decisions? And I think when you start using this tool just to make sure that you're looking at every perspective that you can think of, it highlights gaps that nobody verbally actually said to you. For example, during the consultation of the Birmingham Food System Strategy, one of the areas we realised we needed to add into the Big Bold City tool was prisons. Because although they weren't at the table and talking at the conversations we were having at the time, I found out through LinkedIn, in fact, a stat that for per day, prisoners get less money for food than a child gets for lunch at school. So when you think about the inequalities that often lead to people even being in prison to begin with, then you take into account that they've got the same amount of food as a child that's got to feed them for the entire day. There must be huge amounts of challenging food system decisions that people are making in that space. Also, the other thing that we've discovered is languages. Did you know how many languages out there aren't even written down? So people talk about translation in terms of, oh, we've got to have written languages, we've got to translate it. But actually, there are a huge number of languages that are just oral. They're not supposed to be written down and they're not written down. So you have to be creative and think, well, how do we communicate if there is a language that isn't usually written? Some of the projects that people we've worked with have used before is WhatsApp messages, where it's just an audio message that's forwarded to people to communicate information. You've also got to consider literacy levels, because somebody might be able to speak a language, but they might not be able to write a language. So when you start looking at these challenges from different directions using this tool, you recognise that there's a lot of different gaps that you might not have thought of, and it starts making you think outside the box with engagement. And you also find people who know far more than you about a certain area of the system than anyone you've spoken to before. So it's really important to keep finding new people, because it's through those interactions that we've generated pretty much any solution we've ever come up with within Birmingham. And the next thing that's really key as well is developing a shared narrative and authentic vision. I know I keep banging on about authenticity, but I think it's so important, because that is what ignites passion in people. It's it being genuinely real. If you're doing empty platitudes about, oh yeah, we need to be healthy and sustainable, that doesn't inspire. What we need to do is have a whole bunch of people who think, finally, we are doing something, and a city has come together to achieve that. And it's pretty challenging to develop a shared narrative in the food system, because there's so many very polarised views, that people have extreme views either end of what we should be doing and why. But then we've also got very different experiences depending on what part of the food system you're in, what your experiences are. So one key thing has been to kind of evolve the key principles of what we stand for, making sure that we run the vision past loads and loads of different people, and I'll be showing the vision shortly on another slide. But I think it's just really key to make sure that it's co-produced and people have contributed to areas that are important to them. And then I didn't even realise how much this vision resonated with people until I found out one of the professors that we work with, she's printed out the vision and she has it on her wall, which I was just like, that's just amazing, because she wants to look at it and it to inspire her work every day. And also she said she meditated on it before she did one of our conferences, and she dreamt about it one night, and then that inspired what she even spoke about during the conference. And I know not everybody's going to have the same interactions and experiences with visions, but that just shows how powerful these things are when somebody connects with it and they recognize that this resonates with them and what they believe in and what they're trying to achieve. And I was trying to think about like analogies for shared visions and how you work together. First of all, I thought, well, every part of the puzzle is like a jigsaw, but I was like, well, that's too rigid. And then whatever, with all the jigsaw pieces that you have of all the people put together, like each one's not necessarily aware of what's happening somewhere else in the system, somewhere else in the jigsaw. So I was like, oh, maybe it's a cooking pot, because you can throw all sorts of things together and it can be evolving, exciting, and create exciting meals that you might not have expected, and each person's adding something different. But you can easily mess up a meal and you can't go back, like the meal's destroyed. So I was like, well, that's a little bit pessimistic. I was like, I want something that can evolve and change. And then I realized that what is the best analogy for a food system and the people involved is an orchestra, because each individual instrument can be wonderful or it can be dreadful. And that's just a fact. So, but it can also be because of the person, it can be because of poor equipment, bad instructions, people aren't aware of what everyone else is doing and what they're trying to achieve. And if you get it right and people come together, it can become complete. It can be lovely, and it can also bring so much momentum that you get goosebumps, and that it radiates out and it inspires everybody else around you. And the other thing that's interesting about the concept of an orchestra with a food system is people will just be playing a different tune, just different priorities, not aligned. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just when you throw it together, it doesn't quite fit yet. And I think that's where having an overall system approach helps, because it's like the conductor bringing it together and aligning everybody's different tunes and making sure that we're like all singing from the same hymn sheet, and that we can just achieve something brilliant. And I think that's how I see food systems, that sometimes we just need to listen to the individual elements, find out why it's going wrong and how we can improve it. The next part of the system, which this really resonated with me when I saw it online a few months back, Bill Banier said, we need to stop trying to design the solution and instead design for the conditions that enable the emergence of many solutions. And this is it. Like, honestly, this was the moment I was like, this is what everybody's missed, because I've seen like evidence-based intervention development for years, and what you often get is an absolutely superb project that was phenomenal, and people say, I want that, I want to copy that, I want that to happen. And what they do is they capture all the processes and all the individual elements that made it successful, and then they want to just implement that exactly somewhere else. And what often happens is it doesn't quite work as planned, or it lacks the momentum, or it's just a bit flat. Sometimes it works, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it just seems to be a little bit lacking, and people are like, oh, well, then it didn't work, so therefore we'll give up on it. It's like, no, they've missed the most important essence of what made that project work, and that was the people involved. And I think this ecosystems for change concept, where you need all these voices together, and then so many solutions will emerge. So we need people with the passion and motivation to take action. You need people with the authority or mandate to drive change. You need people who can broker, facilitate, and coordinate. People who can connect diverse communities. People who can represent and document progress accessibly. People with access to the problem space, for example, work sites or the places that we're actually trying to intervene. People with specialist knowledge, skills and tools. People with resources to contribute, whether it's money or labour. People who will be the user or affected by the intervention, and people with lived experiences of the issue and ground level context. So you need the voice of intent, design, capability and experience. And if you don't have any of those, you will always be limited. So people often say, no, we need ground up approaches, it needs to be grassroots driven. Or somebody goes, oh, we need to shift things from the top and do policy level change. No, we need literally all of them. We need everything in between and all versions of this complex governance to make things happen. But we need to also self-reflect on the groups and the voices that we've got when we're developing solutions to make sure that we have these voices represented and that we can actually generate real change. And I think the way that I saw it in practice recently, where you start to get more diverse voices, was the Food Farming and Countryside Commission did their national conversation about food this summer. And they featured Birmingham and Cambridge, and they used a sortition approach, which is basically where you get a representative randomised sample of people together to explore an issue. So in 4 meetings over 3 weeks, this random collection of people that represented our communities came together to explore a whole range of different policy solutions from across the entire food system. And the idea was to allow them to explore what food policy really means and what they want to see from government going forward. So the idea is to influence national government and the elections coming up. And they explored the positives, the pitfalls, the trade-offs of the different policy proposals, and then they came up with their own manifestos and ideas of what worked. And I think what I was most struck by with this event was that it was actually representative, because far too often we say, oh, we did this community engagement event and we spoke to people, therefore we've ticked that box, we've engaged. But then when you think about it, you often get the same people speaking at lots of these events. If we stop at that point, you will never have a representative sample. You need to be out there going to people. Farmers, for example, people say, oh, they didn't come to my event. I was like, did you go to them? You must go to those people where they are and find out their experiences. But yeah, I think a mixture of this sortition type approach, looking at building the conditions for change. I think if you self-reflect and think about what it is you're doing as you develop interventions and policy ideas, we can just validate our views and also recognise where we're falling short and make changes to shape that in the future. The next part is to co-develop a plan. So what's really important with developing a strategy, so we've done the Birmingham Food System strategy, is you absolutely do not stop there. The strategy is just a vision that brings people together, means that we're all together as one orchestra singing the same song. But what we also need to do is make sure that the tasks are evolving, that we reflect on our action plan and what needs to happen and when to make this actually be implemented. But you cannot assign tasks to people. You can't say, oh, therefore you there should be doing this, because that's not going to win their hearts and minds. They're not actively involved. They're not invested from their own perspectives. So what you need to do is find out from those people who are already inspired and find out, what do they need? What help do they need to overcome the barriers they face to achieve the things that we want to collectively do? And then my action then is to solve that for them. For example, looking at food procurement and the barriers to knowing how to word the tender and the contracts to shape things in different ways. How do you actually assess whether something's sustainable or nutritious or ethical? All those sorts of factors. We recognise that the barrier there was the evidence-based knowledge of what the content needs to be in those words. And then that person within procurement is much more able and empowered to then implement that action themselves. But we need to find out what the barriers are to actions before we start assigning them. And the other thing to do is to truly scope the whole breadth of what you want to know, and also capturing the research questions and things that you'd like to find out and communicating those loudly, because there are so many people working on food system innovations at the moment that if you can communicate what is helpful to policy and practice, we can start aligning our approaches and sharing knowledge across an entire city. And the other thing that I've discovered as well is loads of people are already delivering so many actions across the food system, but they just weren't captured in one place. So the other thing to do is find out what are people already doing and weave that together into a broader narrative. So it's not about creating brand new actions, but also bringing together things that are already happening. So these are some of the key areas within the Birmingham Food System strategy. And what's really important with the entire approach is that you cannot do it all. It is literally impossible to fix the entire food system alone, but you don't need to. So the first thing you need to do is, as I said, have have a vision that unites people. You need to have key principles that, for us, we've decided that we want to collaborate, empower and equalise. And we've also got the concept of the regenerative food system, where we need to consider the environment, communities and economy, but also the unintended consequences of if you do an action on one area that has a negative impact on another. So if you do something that's good for the environment, but it's really bad for food businesses and the economy, that won't be viable. So these concepts are things that have united us. But what we've also recognised is that this has got to be bigger than you. As much as it might be nice to say, oh yes, I've developed the food system strategy and I'm developing that, that is absolutely not how it happens. This has been a genuine co-production of a vision, of a document, and all I've been doing is facilitating these connections. And actually, that's the biggest area. Linking back to my first point about somebody who works across the system, the most important thing you can do is find out who's already doing things in the system and connect them to other people doing things in the system, because that is where the sparks of ideas come together, and often they just need a little bit of support to get pushed over the edge. And as much as it becomes bigger than you and it's unwieldy and it's like you don't know what's going to be happening, actually you need to unleash the entire power and momentum to be far bigger than you could ever imagine, because then it's inspiring people you don't even know. I've known people who've picked up our strategy without ever hearing a single presentation about it, and have been inspired just by looking at the document and what is there. And that's something that's powerful, because then you're not reliant on individuals, you're reliant on this vision being bigger than you and inspiring people wherever it goes. And I think one of the examples recently where I realised that we've actually been able to build this momentum was to discover that the dietetics course at University College Birmingham has just been set up, and it's based on the Birmingham food system strategy. I was so incredibly amazed to hear that they were so inspired by our approach that they're shaping an entire future of dietitians, and how they teach them and how they shape their learning is based on the concepts in the Birmingham food system strategy. It includes modules and how they go about it. And we'll be now working with dietetic students from early 2024 on food policy challenges. So we're looking at culturally diverse healthy eating guidance, and how dietitians and the students can support us with developing really diverse practical guidance for all sorts of different people across our city. But that all happened without me ever knowing that dietetics course was even being set up. And then I found out that the lecturer that's joining the dietetics course moved to Birmingham because they were inspired of what was happening in the city and they wanted to work in Birmingham, and then they applied for the job on that dietetics course. And again, that's bigger than any one person. And what's happened now is that we hear more and more is that people are coming to the city to work on different departments, different areas, because they recognise that the passion that they have can be realised in the city. And I think that's something that's incredibly inspirational, that the more you build momentum, the more you attract people who have the attitude to bring about absolutely revolutionary change in their own areas as well. And the only thing to add there is that sometimes you need a decision-making tool to help coordinate all these actions across the system. So within the strategy, we also developed a food action decision-making and prioritisation tool to help us choose where to prioritise our efforts, because we can facilitate connections in so many places, but how do we choose which ones to do first and which ones need to come lower down the list? And I think having a decision-making tool like that, a little bit like, so that's what we call the FADMAP tool, and along with the Big Bold tool, it helps direct what could be a very chaotic sort of area of work, and it reins it into being something that has overall direction and people can get behind and understand the reasons behind your decisions too. Now, this is the area where I think is the most underutilised concept in food policy, and it's about behavioural science. We should be applying behavioural science to absolutely everything, because we are people and the entire system is people, and we need many, many, many people to do something differently. So all of that is behavioural science. And I think sometimes it's easy to think about behavioural science about these perfect little models that will predict what people will do and when, but it's not about that. It's about using models to help us predict what tendencies and likelihoods there are, and also enabling you to look at different outcomes if you consider different factors. It's kind of a scientific approach to predicting and shaping people's behaviour. The first obvious one that's been building momentum in recent years is the COM-B model. So this is developed by Susan Mickey and colleagues. And that concept is that for any behaviour to take place, we need the capability, opportunity, and motivation to make that happen. And I think this is a really useful concept, because sometimes we think, oh, we just need to give more knowledge. Let's give somebody a leaflet. Let's give them a lesson, and then they'll change their behaviour. So sustainable eating, or whatever your priority objective is. But when you start looking at the COM-B model, you realise that if they're not motivated to do it, it's never going to happen. If they haven't got the opportunity to do it, it's not going to happen either. So it helps you consider every action from different angles. But the other area, which I think is really powerful and is tremendously underutilised, is social dynamics. So a lot of the time people see this as, oh, you just put a percentage on something and say, oh, 80% people are eating this menu option, therefore it will convince somebody to do it because we're using social norms. And that isn't utilising social dynamics to its fullest extent. Because first of all, it's got to be people that you actually relate to. It can't be just random 80% that feels disconnected. It must be 80% of people that are like you. So that's the first concept to consider. But also, there's loads of other social dynamics that you can utilise. So there's social learning. So we often learn from others by observing their behaviours and interacting. There's social comparison. So comparing yourself to others, both upwards and downwards, has a huge impact on our behaviours and how we behave in different social situations. Social norms, as I mentioned, so that's following the behaviour of other people. Often it's in order to be liked or accepted, but it's that belonging type of thing. So if you feel like people like you do a certain behaviour, you'd be more likely to do that behaviour too. It's almost like, oh, if they did it, then and I relate to them, then that's a safe choice for me to make too. The other concept is social facilitation. So the sense of being observed creates an atmosphere of evaluation. So this can sometimes be that if you just feel like somebody's going to check up on the food policy document that you created, you're more likely to make it look good. Like, oh, I've got to make sure I've thought about this angle, or what this person's going to say, or what this person's going to think. And it's not that you want people to feel tested, but it is quite a powerful mechanism. If somebody feels like they're going to be assessed later, it's like if you know you're going to be audited, people are going to be more thorough what they're doing because they don't want to be caught out later. Another concept is social cooperation, so working together to achieve a common goal. That's incredibly powerful, especially around something like a food movement. Social competition, so this can be striving to achieve the same goal or the same outcome as someone else, like you want to be able to achieve those things. That can be very motivating for some people. Also, social recognition, so receiving appreciation and acknowledgement of success in front of an audience, or just having that acknowledged around your peers, whether it's people you work with or broader. The other concepts, I can share all these things later, by the way, if anybody wants a full list. The other idea that I think people underutilise is tipping points and thresholds for social change. So when you're working out how to convince people to change their behaviour, it's important to realise how much of a minority or majority action it is. So there's a professor and colleagues called Centola et al. Who explored that 25% is the magic threshold where you get a tipping point and you can achieve large-scale social change. And I think vegetarianism and veganism is a great example of this. So many years ago, it was very much a minority act to not eat meat and have plant-based options. But as time's gone on, there's more and more and more people who make those choices, and it suddenly doesn't become a minority choice anymore. It's something that loads of people do, and it feels and it links to the social norms and people like you. I'm sure that literally every one of us knows loads of people who don't eat meat, and it's become such a behaviour that's typical that we've reached that tipping point, and that's when you can achieve large-scale social change. However, if you're asking somebody to do something and they're in the first 1% of anyone doing it, it's unlikely that you'll convince someone to do it unless there's somebody who particularly loves being the first one to do something. But it's easier to achieve large-scale social change when you reach that tipping point. If 25% of people are doing something, you're much more likely to develop change. If it's less than that, you've got to think about how to engage those early adopters, the people that it's the first time that they'll have done it, but they're proud of being novel. When it's over 25%, all you need to say is, look, everybody you know is doing it, and actually it's really easy and it's the simplest choice. That's when you get the momentum there. So basically having a tailored approach depending on how much an action has been implemented is really key, and not just treating everybody the same depending on the action. Another area that I think has been really underutilised as well is personality traits. And I think the one big issue there is how much personality tests and the sort of pop psychology version of personality tests and that sort of thing has come into the main over like the past 2 decades probably. But actually, although there's not a huge amount of evidence for the personality tests themselves in terms of giving you a bunch of letters and saying this means you'll act like this in this situation, there's a huge amount of issues with the validity of those approaches, because it depends if it's in a work context, in home, and so on. But what there is a huge amount of validity for is the big 5 personality traits, the core concepts that those tests are often based on. That one has got lots of evidence, and especially when you start looking at there's like sub-facets to those areas. So there's 10 facets and there's 30 sub-facets to each of those personality areas. So whether it's the ones like extroversion or my brain's lost me for a moment, but yeah, I'll come to those in a moment. So yeah, depending on which areas you're looking at, it can be incredibly powerful to recognize that people interact based on their personality. So people might be impulsive, they might be compliant, they could be low in trust, they could be dutiful, they might be self-disciplined, assertive, anxious, many, many traits. And people will respond to exactly the same situation in very different ways. And also, if you put lots of people together in a room with different traits, you don't know what the response will be. It's incredibly unpredictable. But what you can start to do is use these the variety of traits to explore and predict, well, what might happen if somebody doesn't really like being told what to do, then they're not going to respond well to then having some intervention that's telling them what to do. So it's that sort of concept that if you can just reflect on personality traits and how that might have an interaction with the sorts of things that you're developing, there's also lots of evidence into looking at the likelihood of different personality traits and political decisions or attitudes around climate change. So when you start looking at things like that, you can start to realise that you need a completely different approach for somebody who's already very on board with supporting the planet and changing the world, compared to somebody whose priorities just lie elsewhere. So you need a completely different approach depending on personalities. And the other thing that's really key is we must focus our resources, whether it's cash or whether it's our staff capacity, we've got to focus where small changes will make a big difference. Because recently, for example, there is the Coca-Cola lorry that was coming to Birmingham, and people are like, what are you going to do about it? I was like, what can I do about it? Like I could shout as much as I wanted about how much I don't want big corporations to be shaping the food in our city and advertising, and it is genuinely a really important issue. But I also recognise that's not my locus of control. That is not something that I have control over. However, there are things where you can quietly make an absolutely phenomenal difference. For example, if you're shaping the food procurement and you can transform the food that is served for thousands of people for the next 4 years, even if nobody ever knows that you've even done it, that is something that is impactful. And so when I'm looking at literally hundreds of tasks I can be doing at any one point, I always make sure I prioritize the one where it's going to make the difference. And it's not always the biggest issue in, like, for example, corporations and food and junk food advertising and so on, but it's the thing where if I do something, I will have the biggest impact. So we've got to consider what's the realistic level of impact we can have with any actions that we ourselves have. It's not to say that we don't want to campaign on change on a national level, on other areas as well. That's incredibly important too. I just mean with you as an individual, pick the things where you can have the biggest impact. And I think that's quite liberating in the end, because sometimes it can be overwhelmed with the sheer breadth of things that you could be working on across the city. But when you realise that, you know, working on something for a day and rewording that, for example, the food procurement strategy, I had 2 days to work on that because I was connected to it at the last minute before it was going to cabinet. And I was like, right, I'm just going to rewrite it and add all these different elements, align it with food. That 2 days of work was the most impactful thing that I could have done with those 2 days, because now that is something the entire city's bought into. And so for context, that was the food procurement strategy. So we've influenced it using the Birmingham food system strategy. But it's just prioritise where you can actually make a big difference. The other thing is we need to empower people and make sure that at every single opportunity you identify and overcome barriers. So in the last year alone, my team has managed to channel £2 million of funding directly to food aid projects. And honestly, it nearly broke us, but we saw an opportunity that there was money, people were asking what to do with it. We were like, we must get this out to cities and out to people who are making a difference, because we recognise that the single thing that they said they needed most when we engaged in the consultation and development strategy was cash. And it's made such a big difference because those projects are more resilient and have more infrastructure and more equipment than they did before. It's still a drop in the ocean compared to what these projects need, but at least we know with that £2 million, we have made a real big difference. And the other thing we need to do is to fight against stereotypes, because in every area of the food system and with all people in every organisation, every area of the system, it's really easy to make stereotypical assumptions of what they do and why. But as Chinamanda Ngozi Adichie said, she's a Nigerian writer, she says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I think that can be applied to when you're talking about food industry. We can make assumptions about what people think there. But the same can be said for people who are using food banks, or when people are going to a fast food outlet and ordering food. So I think the other side to do is to empower by identifying and overcome barriers, by really overcoming those stereotypes and understanding what they face. There was a story recently that Rachel Loopstra, who's a researcher in food insecurity, shared at an event. And she said about that a storm had washed up thousands of starfish on a beach. And the girl was picking up one and tossed it into the ocean, and then another and then another. And there were people watching amused, thinking, like, what are you doing? You can't save them all. It's impossible to make a difference. And when she returned another one to the ocean, she says, I made a difference to that one. And I think that really resonates, because across the food system generally, there are endless tasks. Sometimes it can feel like an uphill battle, but what you need to do is make a difference with the opportunities you do have. And what you can do is equalise. If you're in a situation where you can shape, for example, in the local authority, the amount of times I've got the opportunity to shape the opportunities that people have, recognise any injustice and say, right, we're not going to deliver this like this. We're going to introduce these principles to open it to more people. There's so many things that we can do. And although being in a council is tough, like there's a lot of rigid processes and it's really complex, but the ability to influence and change is immense. But I also can't do that without, I've got an absolutely amazing team. And you need to build on the momentum of everybody to equalise at every opportunity as well. And I think it's really important to recognise that if you lose your spark and if you feel like you're draining, because it's an incredibly emotionally draining area when you're passionate about something like this, you've got to know that what you've started is bigger than you and you can hand it over to someone else. And it's not your personal responsibility to hold the weight on your shoulders, because this is a collective thing that everybody's striving to do. And if you can hand over the mantle to somebody else if you're starting to get drained, I think that's a really important thing to consider and to prioritise, because it's high adrenaline, there's loads of cortisol from stress, and they're spinning hundreds of plates, and it can either be incredibly thrilling or incredibly stressful, and you've just got to, in those moments, prioritise the task that's going to help someone. And I think that's really, really key. And equalising whenever you see the chance. If there's something that you can do, if you're in a position of power to change practice, to open things up to SMEs, to make more access for somebody who's got disabilities and can't usually access a food bank because there's no ramps, for example, or somebody can't get out of the house. We've got to think about solutions at those opportunities whenever we can. And the other thing that I've realised is that people only ever see the tip of the iceberg. So you must share your story. No one ever knows the sheer breadth of stuff that's happening behind every door. That's not just in my team. My team are working on like not even my manager knows the sheer breadth of things that my team are working on all the time, because it's immense. But the same goes for every organisation that you speak to. So don't make any assumptions about anyone you're talking to. They may be doing a huge amount of work around sustainability, ethics, nutrition, economy. And just because they haven't told you or been able to communicate it doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And I think I've struggled over the last 2.5 years, because how do you prioritise either doing stuff or telling people about it? And so far I've prioritised the doing. And I have to admit, we haven't been as good with actually sharing all the breadth of things that are happening across the city. But that's what we're doing this year as well. But I think it's really important to make sure that you tell people about what you're doing. It increases connectivity across the system, and it can inspire people without you even realising, if you've got those open communication things happening. And you'll always meet people who assume that they know what you're doing. They had a conversation with you once, and they go, oh, but you're only doing that. That's not their fault that they don't know everything that you're doing. I think you have to grow a thick skin and just think, no, I obviously haven't communicated very well the sheer breadth of what we're doing, or the reason why we've done this, or why we haven't done this. And it's also, there's a lot of people who go on about food policy, especially about, oh, just do this, it's a quick, easy win. There is no quick, easy wins. Everything is monumentally complicated. And you need to step underneath that iceberg with any task that you're thinking of and think, what are the barriers to that happening, and how can we help that happen? And I think that applies to every task that you think of and every organisation that you want to work with. It's really important to continuously learn, evolve, and discover. That's about the people, about your city, about things that are happening, what works, techniques that are effective, learning from your mistakes, from your successes, and how to prioritise. And I think if there's at least anyone that thinks they're an expert on food systems as a whole, they're talking nonsense, because it is impossible. It is colossally huge. And I know there's some people that I've worked with over time that feel like they've got imposter syndrome. They're like, oh, but I don't know as much about this issue as them. Well, they don't know as much about some issues as you do either. So I think it's really important to recognise that all of us are continuously learning and evolving and discovering. And that's the magic of the food system. And I think LinkedIn has been such a, I know I keep going on about it, but honestly, it is a treasure trove. I open LinkedIn and there are like 4 really useful insights right at the top of my feed. But that's made that learning, evolving, and discovering area of what's happening outside the sphere of Birmingham much easier to digest and much more manageable, whilst trying to balance 1,000 plates from every different direction all the time. But I think it's really key as well to self-reflect on every project that you do and never see it's finished. If you developed an intervention, think, well, what would I do differently next time? How can I learn? What can I share to make it easier for somebody else to be able to develop that? We're setting up the Urban Food Cities Forum in the UK, because we recognise that there was very little support for me as a food policy officer to overcome some of the barriers I've faced in local authority trying to implement a system approach. And we recognise that the cities and other urban areas all across the UK that are going to be in the same boat. So that's another way that we're developing an approach to support this continuous evolution and discovering ideas. And I think that the final message that I want to say is, be the change. If not you, then who? Because sometimes it can feel like you're alone. Like, I meet plenty of people who've been doing something amazing in a project, something that's inspiring, but they feel like they're the only person, but they're not. But what's absolutely amazing is they, despite feeling alone, have been in there developing something for their community, trying to do their best in the organisation they're working in to introduce some change. And actually, they're getting stuck in and making that difference. And I think, I remember hearing a story about an IT member of staff who applied for a job in a company just to go in and fix a bug that was in a computer, that in the website that he used. He fixed it and then he quit. He's like, the only reason he wanted to join that organisation was to fix his web experience and then leave it as better than it was before. And I think there's far too little of that in food policy. There's a lot of people campaigning for change, but there's not enough people doing the change. And if not you, then who? Genuinely, I got this job in the council because I was like, someone has got to fix the food system from within in a local authority. And I recognise that it's our responsibility to do that. If you don't like how food procurement is done, if you don't like how the food waste is happening, if you don't like something, see if you can train up and just work in that organisation, because if you can generate that change from within and make that happen, the world will be a better place. And we need to have more people who are inspired to create revolutions work in every organisation, not just looking from the outside and saying and campaigning for change, but actually being in there, implementing the things that are needed to make that happen. So I suspect I've probably gone over my time, so apologies about that. But here's a list of the key features that I see that we need to build a food revolution. There's 15 key areas. There's many, many other things that I think we need to do across the system as well. But I think by following this journey and these steps, you're already on the right path. You'll have the right foundations for change in wherever you are. So thank you very much. Feel free to join me on LinkedIn. As you can tell, I quite enjoy it, so feel free to connect, and especially if you've got useful things to share.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Just a round of applause from me. I've been left feeling energized and totally inspired by your presentation. So an amazing one on a cold winter's evening to have. So thank you, Sarah, for talking us through that vision and those 15 points. Really, really inspiring stuff. And gosh, you're getting some amazing questions in the chat already. I've been hard at work triaging them, and there's some great questions coming through. If I can take the first up the chair's prerogative, as it were, because we're at the Centre for Food Policy, and we're here thinking about policy in practice. What are the key takeaways you have for the wider policymaking community and the wider practitioner community? So thinking about that at maybe, let's start at the local level, but then also saying to people in national governments or regional governments, how can we support and get on board? What are the main takeaways the practitioners need to be thinking about here, the doers?
And I think there's a huge amount of great examples of food policy out there. There's really inspirational examples of how people have overcome challenges they face. But I think as a policymaker in local government, you often feel completely unmoored and you don't know how to navigate the actual system you're in. So to create change in something like a local authority where there's so many layers of governance, so many approvals, it can feel like an insurmountable challenge. So I think there's got to be more support about the implementation of policy, not just what the policy needs to be. Examples of how people can overcome some of those barriers, because I think we've got the knowledge and the content that's required. But if somebody says, oh, you need more SMEs in your food supply chain, and they go, I agree, but I just don't know how. And that is a huge barrier when you've got this Goliath version of procurement where you've got £21 million over 4 years. How are you supposed to suddenly shake that up and come up with some other procurement solution that supports local food without some help with how to navigate that journey from a previous way of doing things through to the new way?
Really, really good to highlight that. And for the national level, we've got a few questions on national, so we may want to touch on it later, but is there anything a national level policymaker, whether not from this country or from the UK, should be taking away as things they need to go away and do right now? Well, probably in January, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think the rural-urban connections are key. So in cities, we don't have enough like local sustainable food. We need more delivery hubs and ways to make it something that is easy to navigate within a city setting, because at the moment, like, you often don't even know where your food's come from. Even when you get it from the local market, that they've got it from some other supplier, and it's very difficult to actually find genuinely like local, sustainable, well-produced, ethical food. But then you'll go speak to somebody in a rural area and they can't shift their food. It's like, okay, we've got a disconnect here. We've got a huge amount of people who could be purchasing food. We've got a huge amount of people who are producing it. But what we're missing is logistics and distribution. And that being done in a way that doesn't take away people's independence and the approach that they've got, but they can benefit from like collectively working together on some of these challenges, because that's often where the costs are. Logistics and distribution is incredibly costly. So if each individual person is working on that, it will never be the economically viable choice for anybody to shift food purchasing behaviours. But actually, I think on a regional and national level, that would be such an easy fix to be able to develop integrated solutions to connect the rural and urban areas and make it an economically viable choice for farmers to be able to shift their practices as well.
some really exciting examples there, and some of those aren't the sexiest in terms of, transport and logistics. Sometimes are not the visibility items, and again, you've touched on that before. And again, we'll come back to that. We've got a few questions. We've now, oh my gosh, the number of questions just keeps growing. Please, everybody, keep putting them in. This is amazing. And there's some really great questions there, which I'm going to start with. So there's a series of 3 questions, all looking at, well, so Michelle P first asks, great talk. Could you speak a bit about what you anticipated being your specific priorities going into the job, and whether and how they differed from what you ended up doing? And then likewise, Rosie Osborne is again thanking you for your amazing talk and asking about more detail on your decision making and prioritization tools. So just in terms of how you are thinking through these processes and how you're embodying them in life. So in terms of what you thought you were going to be going into and how that is different or how that is similar. Would you be able to speak a little bit more about that? I know you had a bit of detail there.
I'd say this sounds terrible. I've avoided working in local authorities and in public health my entire life because it's not dynamic and fast enough. I've worked alongside and with and been commissioned by those organisations a lot of the time, but I recognise that it's a tough place for passionate people where that passion can get stamped down because you're restricted by existing processes. So when I joined, it was fully knowing that I was finally joining at the level where I would have control of an entire little world below me. Like, food was mine and I was allowed to make decisions. And I don't think I could have joined if it wasn't for that perspective. The other thing that I did is I actually joined and it was supposed to be a food team. So it was within public health. And the fantastic thing about public health is that tackling injustice is at the core of what we do. So rather than it being economic benefits or anything else, tackling inequalities and injustice meant that you can put that at the core of anything that you do within food systems, whether it's economy, environment, and so on, because the impacts, the people that suffer the most are always the ones that are facing the inequalities. And that is just not acceptable. So I think that's always been my driver, is to tackle inequalities. And also, I think I didn't recognise when I was younger, but as I've got older, I recognised that my ability to see utter chaos and then turn it into a pattern that's manageable, and then handing that simplified, like, oh, it looks so easy when you say it like that, type plan to other people is something that other people don't, it doesn't come to people naturally. And actually doing that through the strategy and through the communication, I think that's exactly what I wanted to achieve, and I have done. So I don't think it's any different to what I expected. I think I didn't expect the momentum to build and the council to take it on so well. I think because we're productive and achieving different priorities and objectives across the system, it's been surprisingly easy to convince management that actually being quite revolutionary in approach is something that's good to do. And the other thing that's been amazing, honestly, my team is incredible. So Bradley, Rosie, Neve and Chloe and all the other people who've worked with me before and supported the team, you cannot do it without those people, and those people have their own expertise. So I think that's really helped the momentum since we've started to.
No, thank you very much. And the chat has gone, well, sorry, the chat box has gone absolutely wild with questions. Guys, please put them into the Q&A box so I can just triage them and group them so we can get through the maximum number of questions as possible with Sarah at once. And again, some of these questions you've just started answering, as it were, in some of your answers. But thank you again, Sarah. This is some fascinating answers you're giving. I'm going to change tack. Well, actually, no. There's Ruth Hegarty has just put into the chat, while we're on kind of your role and your development, Ruth Hegarty has just asked, what was the background of Birmingham Council creating this position? Were civil society groups lobbying for this or pushing, or are you allowed to speak about this, or should we kind of remain tight-lipped? Yeah.
No,
can other people replicate this? Because I guess the other people have been asking, do councils need to create this role? How can they create this role?
Yeah. I think the key driver behind what made this entire approach start was, first of all, having Paulette Hamilton, who was the Cabinet Member for Health and Social Care, and also Dr. Justin Varney, who's the Director of Public Health, thoroughly behind this concept. There was the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact and International Food Conferences, and back in, I think it's about 2015, they engaged in an event and they saw what was possible in some other cities. Like Milan's like us 10 years ago. Like they're 10 years ahead. But to see what's possible when you have that integrated approach was really inspirational for them as political leaders, as for leaders of public health. And they were like, we want that. The one challenge we had was that happened once they started to build that momentum. That's when COVID happened. So the entire public health department was deployed on COVID response, and I joined just after that. So the reason they set up a separate food team is they realised the momentum had really slowed down during COVID response, and they wanted to set up a separate team to pick up the pace. So that's why we ended up with a separate food team rather than it being integrated in with other priorities. There's also, during lockdown, there was a huge amount of food parcel redistribution taking place with community food projects. And the Food Justice Network was set up in that time. So that's a network of, I think it's over 250 community organisations, voluntary projects across the city. And that Food Justice Network is phenomenal. The people and the places involved with those projects, they were the backbone to the city and supporting the most vulnerable through that time. And there's a huge amount of momentum there. There's also incredible growing networks and people campaigning to make it so they've got access to land. And from within, we're trying to see, well, how do you make it so you can actually access land and grow on it? I have to say, it's really complicated. That's one of those iceberg ones, but we are working on it. But I'd say that what happens is we connected together several different momentum areas, and they happen to align and come together in that space. The other thing that was really powerful was the Mandala Consortium, which is one of the UKRI Transforming UK Food Systems projects. And they chose Birmingham as the city to focus on, partly because of these early conversations about being inspired around food, so it all lined up timing wise. But that academic interest and driving things forward has really helped as well. So we had the community area, we had the academic area, political leadership, and then also having it based within public health, where everybody wants to tackle injustice, and that being a real passionate driver for change.
Thank you very much. Again, I think I'm going to take 3 questions and ask them simultaneously, and it's slightly leading. Forgive me because I'm being a little bit cheeky here. But so Charlotte Gallagher-Squires, who's a researcher at the centre, but coming in from online tonight, is asking, are there any national level actions or policies that you think you might facilitate this type of joined up approach? So leading on from that, how can others replicate, I guess is the question. And Laura Lane, who's a PhD student at the centre, is asking, does this mean every city needs its own food strategy? And the third question that's being asked is by the Emeritus Professor Tim Lang. How is this ambitious policy being affected by the current crisis of funding in Birmingham? And because of this, Birmingham's food system isn't an isolated reality. What about working with other cities, multi-level food? How does multi-level food governance fit into this when central government says next to nothing about food, devolves it to market forces, and isn't funding funding councils correctly? So again, being really cheeky with that sting in the tail of saying, this is all really nice. It sounds like we need something, one of your position in every single government. But what's happening with funding? What's the reality like of that now?
I think, first of all, we're lucky enough within Birmingham that the food system team is based within public health, so that's ring-fenced budget. So although there's economic challenges, especially within Birmingham at the moment, being within a public health team and having the inequalities at the core means that our core staff are okay at the moment, at least. And there's lots of other budgetary areas that would be cut before the staff are. So we're in a position where we can facilitate a huge amount of change. And whenever I have access to funds and budget, I make the biggest difference I can with it, but it doesn't stop me from making a change. Like, we are an incredibly low resource team that we can make a huge amount of difference without much resource, as long as we've got the people to connect them together. I think the other thing that we've done is spend a lot of other people's money, because we develop really fantastic ideas that go, because I didn't even intend, like Rosie and my team, she's been leading the food provision response for the cost of living response in the council, which is our local approach to supporting people in crisis and those who are vulnerable. We didn't plan to lead that. What we did was we sent some evidence-based recommendations of the sorts of things we thought they should be doing, because we heard a rumour that there was something that would be happening. We're like, we know that actually projects need cash. They don't need food parcels. They need to be empowered to support their own communities in the way that works. They're like, oh, that's a really good idea. Do you want to lead it? I was like, okay. So we ended up accidentally leading that, but then we made the most, and we developed a grant making process that was really co-produced with people, and it really worked. So I think you can be quite innovative in those ways, that especially with levelling up money, with other approaches where you can be creative with how you can achieve objectives and spend other people's money. If you're clever and do it in a way that achieves so many priorities, it's so evidence-based, so pragmatic and solution-focused, and people buy into it, it's something that people want to get behind. The other area is research funding and innovation projects. We're now allowed to apply for EU money again with the Horizon, so we're looking at opportunities for that. And also, as I said before, we're not the only ones making a change in the city. There are the council, we might be facilitating it, but genuinely it's so much bigger than us. There are so many people doing things there. In terms of multi-level governance, it's absolutely essential to learn from other cities. Like the amount of times you feel like you're starting from scratch and you're like, I know people must have done this before. So that's the sort of thing we're developing. We've got lots of international partnerships, and we're developing the ones across cities. I think in terms of having, I mean, yes, it's an absolute blessing to have a food system team, but I think the most important element is a system team. Whether you're doing it through climate change, whether you're doing it through economy, whether you're doing it through tackling inequalities, whether it's around food, I think that's because we're tackling so many other issues. Food happens to be the thing that links it together. But I think there's a huge amount that could be achieved through other approaches, as long as you've got someone system thinking in the council. So I think I'd probably be pushing for that over food specific. Yes, food strategies are supported, but only if you've got the capacity to make it something that's got the full level of buy-in and facilitation. I've forgotten some of the other questions. If you can remind me.
I think that's a really good wrap up of those three quite thorny questions there. So thank you so much for asking them, or answering them, I should say. I'm aware we've only got about 5 minutes left, and about 14 more questions we'll try and burn through. So I'll try and do three at once here, if that's okay. Are you ready for this?
Yeah.
Okay. So a few of the different groups were saying, oh, we don't have even one person on a food systems team, or our council isn't thinking. We've got a lot of different local food system operatives on the call tonight, which is brilliant to see. What are your first steps? Part one. Part two, do you have any advice in terms of smoothing out collaboration between various people at various levels? How do you successfully convince people that you are trying to help and reach a common understanding between these different groups at the local level? Any tips there? So they're kind of the same question, a little bit more scope there. Let's leave it at those two, because the final question that we've got actually is, are there any tools for coordination, communication, or collaboration? Is it you're using the council infrastructure, or are you bringing in any other tools that you would like to highlight to the wider group of operatives in terms of stuff that's worked for you at a tool level for collaboration?
In terms of communication, generally, it's whatever method suits the person you're connecting with. Like, it is just personal connections on whatever form that makes. So yes, we utilize the council-based processes, but actually the biggest success we have is doing it in a very personal way and going to people. I think the other thing that's really key is when you're trying to connect people across the whole system, is just go have a conversation with them. Don't go to them with a proposal, don't go to them with a plan. Just find out about them, their experiences, their barriers, what they need. And then when you speak to the next person, you go, oh, they've got the same issue, but from a different perspective. So you've got to listen before you start saying anything. And I think that helps with linking things together. And then there was one other area. What was that one?
Just in terms of, are there any specific tools, framework, tools for coordination, communication, collaboration? So are there any other things you're thinking through there? I do love the idea of listening to the Food Systems Orchestra, though. It'll make different sounds. So are there anything else you'd recommend to people?
I think you've got to develop really huge amounts of multi-level governance, different ways of engaging. And I've discovered there's a lot of people, especially busy people, that you could get them all together on a webinar, but then you just have people who sat there with the camera off and not talking. So you're actually better off having a high quality 45-minute conversation one-on-one with loads of people. You will get far more from that than you would with, and also a better relationship with them than you would otherwise. The other thing that we've been doing is developing different action groups and different levels of connections and collaborations and way of contributing. So I'd be happy to show, we'll be sharing more about that in January anyway, but I think just going from all angles all the time.
Brilliant. And just to follow up, so is that related to the decision-making and prioritization tool you mentioned earlier during the talk? Is that the thing you're talking about later, or we can provide links to in the...
No, so the FADMAP tool is within the strategy.
Okay.
We've also got a video. We did a launch conference in October, so we've got a video just about the FADMAP tool on the YouTube link that explains
Lovely.
how
We'll try and
we
link in our
utilise it.
YouTube.
But the key reason for that was because we kept being asked to do things that I didn't agree with, and I was like, I need a prioritisation tool. That means the tool said no, not me, which is very honest.
No, but also a really
But
important thing
honestly,
to
it's
have
powerful
a
because
transparent
then you
process.
say, this is why I did this and this is why I didn't, because it's very easy to be pushed one way or the other. But I can categorically say, no, it doesn't tick that box and this one does. That's why I'm doing this. And it just means that you're accountable, and it also means you don't get pushed into things that you don't agree with doing. So that's what made me generate the tool to begin with.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you so much. I'm aware we're rapidly running out of time. So if you want, let's draw a close to the questions there to give us the maximum amount of time available, if that's okay with you. Just because I'm aware you have to head off quite shortly. Would you be able to just, so Elaine has put in the chat the link to the Birmingham Food Strategy, which I think has links to the tool that you've discussed within it. People are already saying thank you so much in the chat. Please do put your hands together to thank Sarah again. Thank you for all of the different questions you've been able to answer in this rapid fire session. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here this evening. Thank you for being our December 2023 Food Thinkers panelist.
Thanks so much, everybody. I'm glad to have joined you.
See you in 2024. Thank you again. So fabulous to have you with us. Bye.